My name is Lori Severson. I'm president of the Edina Chamber of Commerce. I also lead our Green Umbrella Wellbeing Initiative as well as the Edina Innovation Lab. Very happy to be here today. I want to thank you for joining us for the Future of Wellbeing Minnesota Leading the Way. This is actually the fourth meeting that we've had in a series of four to dig a little deeper into the future that Minnesota has in leading local, national, regional, and international well-being in that space. And the way the Edina Chamber became involved is that, as many of you know, we have a wealth of healthcare and well-being assets along France Avenue. And over the years, many of those organizations came to me and said, we're aware of the work that Medical Alley and Greater MSP are doing, and they're doing wonderful work. How can we become involved? How can we shine a light on what Minnesota is doing and what we're doing? So the Edina Chamber of Commerce partnered with Global Wellness Connections along with Future IQ and their team to help us look at that question. So what we're going to do today, and to be honest, we thought this research would go in one direction, and you're going to find out today that it took a slightly different track than we expected, which I guess is what it's all about, right? If we knew the direction that it should go, we'd be doing that. So Future IQ was kind enough to step in and help us figure this out. Many of you know David Beurle and the Future IQ team. They've done a lot of work in Minnesota, a lot of work here in Edina, but I want to give you a little bit of background on David. They've done groundbreaking research in, as I said, Minnesota and all around the world. David is a world-renowned expert on community, regional, and organizational economic revitalization. His work extends, as I said, local, regional, through corporate and governmental levels with a focus on future thinking. And that's really what we wanted this project to take a look at. We know what we're doing now, but what are the trends out there and what can we be doing to solidify and shine a light on what Minnesota is doing in the future? He specializes in creating innovative future planning approaches for the use in regional and organizational settings. He developed the groundbreaking Future Game as a widely used planning and workshop tool, which has successfully been used across the world. And he pioneered the application of the scenario planning process, which we used in this project to regions and rural industries around the world. Can you please join me in welcoming David Beurle?
Thanks, Laurie. All right, hello everybody. All right, so I'm going to stand here because we're streaming this for people who are watching online. And I want to really spend a little bit of time going through the journey that we've been on. So I know a number of you have attended each one of these sessions. Some of you are new to it, right? So we are going to kind of recap a little. But the recap I want to do is with the lens of where we got to. So sort of overlaying that on what we think are some of the key issues. The structure I want to kind of follow is I want to talk about what we think is the opportunity that's been identified through the course of this set of deliberations. So what do we think is this macro opportunity? We then want to talk about, well, what do we think is the challenge moving forward? And then we want to talk about what are the sort of the recommendations that are coming out of this and ground truth those with you and sort of get some buy-in on that or some input onto that process. So I'm going to take about 30 or 40 minutes to go through that process. We'll have some discussion and then Jim Hovland's going to wrap us up. So let's dive in, right? So foresight process, ultimately this has been about building a roadmap to the future. So we've been exploring the future. If you know about foresight research, it's this notion of looking into the future and sort of trying to think about how the future might look. As we kind of explore future thinking, there's a couple of elements that have been really important, I think, in our deliberations that are right at the key of effective future thinking. And one is about trajectory. If you think future thinking, you're always going to have trajectory in your mind, right? So what direction are we going? What direction do we want to go? What direction are we being pushed? But it's all about trajectory, right? But the other one that's really key is the velocity component. And so we've been probing velocity as we go through this. I don't think any of us would pretend that we can predict the future with absolute certainty. But I do think we can have a pretty good go at thinking about what the shapes and the contours of the future might look like. You know, what might be the kind of landscape of the future. So as I go through this sort of discussion, I'm going to share with you what we think is that shape and contour of the future for the Midwest and for the future well-being in the Midwest context as well. The process, some of you have seen this, but we went through a series of focus groups through February. We had the think tank process in April, Future Summit, and then the report sort of over the summer period. And now we're at this point of sort of trying to lock in on the roadmap and get some traction going forward. I want to first of all cover the kind of opportunity conversation, right? So we looked a lot at trends, and I'm going to share just some highlights of those with you. But this is all that deliberation about the future, but trying to understand where do we think there's opportunity, okay? So I want to just share that with you, and I want to talk about the scale of the opportunity and what we concluded from that. The kind of big kind of topic areas of things that we thought were future trends, and I'm going to show you some of these data points, but the whole issue of food, water, energy, absolutely my argument. I've been kind of arguing this with nobody because nobody disagrees, right? But I've been saying this for some years now about that being just a fascinating convergence of trend lines and assets that make a really compelling opportunity for the upper Midwest and Minnesota. And that ties to the impacts of climate change. Societal value shifts, population changes, clearly driving awareness and interest in well-being, but so on through a range of different things, including technology and so on. But let me just show you a few things, right? So the macro context, of course, and we talked about this in the think tank, is this notion of mass urbanization that's occurring in the world. And this, I think, is just really important for us to keep in our minds, because if you look at pretty much today, the US is 85% urbanized. And that's in urban environments of 100,000 people plus, right? So if we are at the moment where we are now an urban dwelling species, I think that triggers all sorts of different interests in human well-being and wellness. Because fundamentally our lifestyles change, right? When you go from agrarian to urban dwelling, our lifestyles, what we eat, where our food comes from, our levels of activity, all of that changes because we are living in a very different context. Of course, in this country at least, people are aggregating in these mega cities, so society is redistributing around these mega cities. What's so fascinating is that the Twin Cities is one of those, right? So when you think about opportunity of the future, then this evolution of the Twin Cities, which I know is kind of on some people's minds, and where does it fit as a proposition, becomes really important. But for sure, this mega city and where people live, my view is that that drives change and innovation in lifestyles. And I think the whole argument about human well-being is about our lifestyle. How we live, how we exercise, how we take care of our health, our food, and all of those things, but in a context of a lifestyle that's given by the environment that we live in. The other thing that's at play, right, and this is kind of the velocity piece, there's age pyramids for the US 2022, so current data to what it might look like in 10 years. The boomer influence is clearly fading, right? So the red arrows point to the millennial bubble cohort and the boomer cohort. And if you go 10 years after this, of course, then it fades even more. But at least for the next decade, you have two macro cohorts who have an intense interest in well-being. Boomers, who doesn't want to live longer and healthier and kind of make those last kind of decades really kind of count, right? And the millennials, who are super health conscious and are kind of living a very different life. So we've got those forces playing at least in the next decade, and particularly, I think, for the emergent populations coming through as well. Some other data we looked at too, and this is sort of about the changing shape of society. I find this one actually really fascinating, right? So this is about the percent of foreign-born people in this country, right? The green line is percent, so percent of total population. The bar charts, the purple bars, are the absolute numbers. Now, of course, the absolute numbers increase because the population of the country is increasing relatively significantly, right? But the key part about the green line is that we are almost back to the point of the highest ever foreign-born percent in this country. You know, it peaked way back there in the sort of 1800s or something there, right? 1840s or something, but we're almost back to that. But interestingly, the lowest point is in that period in the 70s, right? And I would argue that the 70s is still a prevailing cultural context that shapes a lot of the kind of values and decision-making in society, right? Because of the baby boomer kind of influence, right? So, but we've got this rapidly shifting foreign-born percentages, brings more cultures, voices, has different kind of implications for well-being. Another thing we looked at, and I'm going to probe this one a little, right? So this is a chart that looks at housing shortage or surplus across the country, right? So the browns are the most intense shortages is 2019 data, and the blues is where there's a housing surplus, right? And if you can look into that data closely, you'll see that there are a series of mega cities in the US that are experiencing more acute housing shortage, right? The Twin Cities is one of them, right? But there's a piece here that I find intriguing, which is if you look at the other ones, it is like Denver, Colorado, Salt Lake City, Austin, Texas, Washington, DC, West Coast. What's the narrative that connects those places? That's where all the kind of mobile millennials have been going, right? I mean, they're the go-to places for people who are kind of, you know, bringing talent and perspective and, you know, seeking out these careers. And I don't know that I necessarily would say that the Twin Cities is often included in that cohort in conversations. But at least this data might suggest, well, if it's got an equivalent housing shortage, maybe there's more interesting inbound migration here than we recognise or realise. Okay, so there may be some subsets to that story, but I do think that ties into this value proposition for the Twin Cities and where it might sit in this story about the future well-being and what its appeal might be as a location for people to live and so on. Any perspectives on that? Because when I saw this, I was surprised. I was going, like Austin, Texas, Salt Lake City, Denver, Colorado, you know, Portland, Oregon, Spokane, those places, that's the DC, they're the list of where the interesting talent and capital's going, right? Chicago's not a brown. Interesting, Atlanta's not either, right? But Atlanta's considered one of them, but it's got a lot of other stuff going on there, of course. Yeah, and if you look at it in the upper Midwest context, this is the place that has that pinch, right? Now, assuming that pinch is a relationship of more people wanting to come here than there are existing housing, right? Interesting, right? And I actually, anecdotally, I want to share with you what I think this is driving this, right? I'll come back to that, right? The other part we've talked a lot about, and so recapping in terms of the opportunity, is this whole story of food, water, and energy. So we've talked about this increasing global demand and tried to think about, well, what does that mean for human well-being and its connection to this part of the world? For sure, renewable energy, we're on this whole kind of transformation of energy systems on the planet. You can hear all the pain points right now, but we know that that's really the macro trend is this moving towards the electrification of the world. Just some interesting data, like if you look at things like the wind corridor in the US, so that's that big brown and red sort of strip down the middle. That's where the highest wind speeds are at 30 meters on a regular basis. That's, of course, where the turbine blades are. You can see it slices nicely through this state, if not the upper Midwest, right? And so when you think about renewable energies, this part of the world is well positioned. Now, if you look at a solar map, New Mexico beats you for sure, right? But the technology in those are improving. So you've got the potential for a raft of energy solutions. The other part that's really interesting is about fresh water. We know a lot of the world, and we've probed this in the think tank, a lot of the world is water short, scarcity, pollution and so on. The upper Midwest, parts of the Northeast US have 20% of the global freshwater surface reserves, right? For a percent of the global population that would just be in like a fraction, tiny fraction. Okay, and I think my argument as somebody who looks at a lot of trends, I think the water issue is the big one, right? And when I talk to people who've moved here recently, in fact, I was at a conference, the Food, Agriculture and Ideas Conference that Grow North put on Monday, talking to people there, younger people who said, yep, I came here because there's water. I came from California. So I think there's a kind of an undercurrent trend there, pun intended, undercurrent trend, about people looking for water in the location that they live. Of course, we talked about climate change, the potential positive, negative impacts. The reds here are where the long-term forecasts are for crop yields, agricultural productivity to decline. The greens are where it's likely to increase. Why? Because there are longer growing seasons, yada, 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 right? Think of this from a food perspective tied to human well-being, right? So we have some parts of the world where the ability to be able to produce the nutrients that we consume increases, but we have great swaths of the world where most of the people live and where the population is growing the fastest, where their ability to produce is forecast to decline, right? Yeah, so it's really rough modeling, right? So it's macro. I'm going to drill into a little bit more detail. The darker the green, the greater the potential agricultural productivity gains. Of course, the darker the reds, the more intense the decline. The modelling is just kind of macro, right, in this, because it's a global model. The other part of this is hunger tied to that, right? So here the reds and the oranges and so on, and yellows is where there's already endemic hunger. This is the World Hunger Map 2020. Africa, equatorial regions, if you look at it compared to this, big issue, large populations in the world, declining ability to be able to grow food, and already they're hungry, right? So at a macro level, it started to shape out what I thought is the opportunity we drilled in on. From a human nutrition point of view, we do have this weirdness, right? And there's no way I can describe this other than weird, right? Which is where we have 2 billion people on the planet don't get enough of something, minerals, nutrients, calories. 2 billion people who have too much, overweight and obesity. And I think what's going to happen in the coming decade or two, there is going to be so much pressure being exerted on food supplies and human well-being and nutrition that I think this will get visited. How long can we sustain that kind of discrepancy or polarization in just basic nutrition and availability of food? Drilling into what does this mean in terms of what's the opportunity, this is the unique biomass capability that's literally in your backyard, right? And this looks at biomass resources per square kilometre. So it's normalised to area of land, product capability of production by unit area. And you can see that you're right there in the hotspot, right? And so what I think this has kept pointing to as we go through this process, it draws the lines to this proposition. And then this is another piece here that looks at GDP impact of climate change in the US over time, right? And the red is where the forecast is for GDP destruction. In other words, declining GDP, and the green is where the forecast is for increase. And if you talk to people, and I was in Vermont last week and talking to people in Marquette and Pacific Northwest and so on, they are already seeing people who are buying chunks of land in case, right? So I would make the argument that I think we're right on the tip of a migration pattern change, right? And it's almost like every day that data gets a little bit more reinforced. So the modeling's still pretty early, right? And it has various timeframes. I think this original stuff looked at like a 30-year trajectory, but what I keep seeing is it getting updated and drawing closer together, right? So the GDP destruction is a function of things like loss of productivity, human productivity because it's too hot, but also things like the cost of dealing with catastrophic weather events, okay? And so what we know is happening with climate change is that those catastrophic events seem to be getting, they always seem to report as the worst case scenario, right? Or it's happening faster than our modelling suggested. So quite likely this could accelerate, right? So let me ask, anybody planning to retire to Florida in the last week? Don't think so, right? You know, so I think we'll start to see this accelerate more profoundly. The point, though, is there are people in the green zone who start to look like a really interesting and attractive place, right? And my argument as we go through this, I think what we're starting to build is this perhaps this proposition of, you know, food, energy, water capability, you know, perhaps, you know, improving environmental conditions and improving GDP impact because of climate change, right? And I keep looking at that upper Midwest, right, when I look at this. Of course, then there's the whole acceleration of technology. So I just want to hit on this just for a second, and then I want to sort of get to the recommendations and so on. We know that things like artificial intelligence are accelerating. We've probed that pretty strongly. There is this big issue of thinking about, well, if we're going into this digital transformation, next wave of, you know, industrial revolution, artificial intelligence, are we terrified or are we excited about that, right? And so we could probably round up the room and separate it into two groups, and depends on what the topic is and how you feel on the day. It could be grand solutions for us, or it could be grand challenges. If we take the grand solutions piece and think about how does that tie to opportunity, this region becomes interesting. This is my last slide on the macro trends, right? And this is more kind of current, right? So really just thinking the last couple of months. So if you think of innovation landscape, because for sure one of the things we've been talking about in the future of wellbeing and the opportunity here is the speed of innovation, or the ability for this region to have global leadership in innovation, in wellbeing and medical technology and all of that stuff, right? This is actually some data that was kind of projecting into 2020, and it looks at the high-skilled and technology-intensive manufacturing exports, right? So not a bad way to think about underlying innovation. Three big clusters in the world, China and Asia, Europe, Germany and the UK predominantly, and the US. And I think it's worth thinking about what's going on in the world right now and how this might change or enable innovation in this part of the world. So, because people argue that innovation here, medical alley, medical devices, innovation around health and well-being here is a big part of the value proposition. Let's look at it in the macro sense for a minute, right? So if you look at China, it's interesting, right? Because they're turning inwards. There's been a lot of work in the last couple of years to stop them stealing technology from other parts of the world. You know, the Defense Department here has led a lot of that kind of intervention. It's more problematic. There's more kind of tension in that landscape. So China's kind of almost inevitable trajectory to become this sort of dominant innovation centre and global economic power, I think, is kind of somewhat getting corralled, right? You draw your conclusion on that. My observation is that's currently kind of getting clipped a little bit on the wings. If you look at Germany and the UK, not feeling so great about those places, right? UK seems to have lost its way, right? They just seem to be sliding into economic and social turmoil. It's going to have a big impact on their ability to be able to invest in innovation. You look at Germany, well, they're turning off the taps, right? So it's going to be a tough winter. It's going to hit the industrial sector the hardest, and I can't see that being a short-term phenomenon. You know, even if the immediate conflict with Ukraine and Russia gets resolved. There's a massive rebuilding program. I mean, their attention's going to be all focused internally for some time to come. US, a little different, right? And what this reminds me of in a historical context is post-Second World War, when a lot of manufacturing capacity was basically destroyed in Europe and Japan, and the US was left standing. And if you look post-Second World War, there was a period of extraordinary innovation and technological progress in this country, right? Are we maybe seeing a set of conditions that could create a mini version of that? I don't know. My assumption is I look at that and I go, I kind of be interesting, right? US is better than most at coming out of a crisis of some sort. It might create this macro conditions for something interesting to happen here. Right. So out of all of that, right, the underlying opportunity that I think we've kind of drilled in on is that Minnesota has a compelling opportunity to contribute to the future of human well-being. And I don't think, and we've tested that, and we haven't had anybody really push back on that in a significant way. But it does seem that there is this compelling opportunity to be a significant contributor in this whole topic area. The other one is the opportunity to leverage the productive capability of the natural resources. How we do that and what that looks like, I don't think we've really figured out. But the basics seem to be there. That food, water, energy, innovation capability, that set of resources seems to create this sweet spot. If somehow we can get that right, that could get really interesting. And then the last one, which might be kind of a little bit more out on the skinny branches, right, is the potential for this being a location as a sanctuary for human well-being. You know, quite probably a lot of the world's going to face very stressed conditions. And this will be one of the few places in the world that may not. Even if you look at where agricultural productivity is forecast to increase, a chunk of that's the Ukraine and Russia. And I wouldn't consider those sanctuary locations right now. Okay? So if that's right, if there is this kind of notion of it being a sanctuary, what does that mean in terms of how you capture that? Or what does it mean for the future of the Twin Cities, the Upper Midwest, and so on? I think that's what we've been really probing. People are not going to be starving. They're not going to be short of water. There's a civil society, so resource competition at the level of survival may not be as intense as it will be elsewhere, because we are talking about a lot of the world being in intense competition for resources at the level of survival, if not just living a decent life. What I kind of look for is if I see like a half a dozen things that are seem to be small but odd, but if there's kind of like, if that's the start of some emergent trend, then how do we go, okay, how do we capitalize on that, right? Is that, like if you even look at Bemidji, right? So what's Bemidji's phone area code? Something or other, whatever it is, right? 218 relocate, right? So that's their tagline, 218 relocate, right? So it's like relocate there, and if you look at it, it's because it's you've got the workplace transformation, but you've got this outdoor recreation, and for sure they're going to be moving into that. We're a haven kind of location for quality of life and so on. Talking to people who are in some of the waterfronting locations in the north, they're already seeing growth that's exceeding what they've experienced in the last 20 years, right? So big picture, we think there's a compelling opportunity there, right? Then, of course, you go, well, what's our challenge, right? Because the opportunity defines the challenge to a large degree, right? And we probed this in the think tank, right? So we had this notion of trying to look at, what's the impact and influence that this region has. Are we going to focus on a local scale? Do we go to a global scale? And this was very much about the future well-being. We looked at how do we play together? Is it, what's our collaboration approach? Do we play to our strengths, or do we want to build a really highly functioning ecosystem where resources are shared and you create innovation, right? And the green on the left is where people said, at the think tank said, well, this is where we think we'll go if we don't do anything different, right? This is where our normal behaviour and kind of trajectory will take us. And the blue is where people said they would prefer to see this region end up. And what is really interesting is you've got a big push on the trajectory to that upper right and a fair gap, right? So that implies velocity and sense of urgency, but pushing on ecosystem collaboration and global scale. So if we think about that opportunity defining the challenge, then of course the question is, how do we build strong local appetite to pursue a leadership role in global health and well-being? There's a desire there, but how do we build that appetite where people actually throw their shoulder to the wheel and do the work to create those investments or whatever that we need to. The other part there is a local desire to build a robust collaborative ecosystem to spur innovation. And ecosystems are really interesting, right? Because they take a lot of work to build, right? And they're high trust environments, right? So how do we build this when we already have some siloed type approaches, right? So that's the sort of the point. Then we went into the Future Summit, of course, and we looked at action areas, right? So what came out of that was this clear desire to build on Minnesota's strong collaborative ecosystem environment. So people said, yep, we can do that and we want to do that. This notion of deepening the global fluency, so that ability to be able to be a global player requires some sophistication in being able to, or some fluency in being able to get a seat at the table of big important conversations, be able to put forward your proposition and so on. Fostering this notion of a global destination location. Interesting use of words on the next one. Aggressively pursue and build Minnesota's existing bio and health economies. Again, how that actually happens, I don't think is in clear focus other than that's seen as a compelling need. And then this notion of being a role model region in wellbeing services and technologies. And that basically was what surfaced out of the Future Summit. The recommendations in the report, so I just want to walk through these and then kind of get your reaction to these, right? Anybody read the report, by the way? You all got it, right? Okay. Sorry? They don't have it yet. Okay, all right. Well, okay, so in the report, right, there are these set of broad recommendations, right? So these are like, you take all that and you say, okay, how do we now activate that and start to put that into sort of momentum, right? So one is about building support for a 5-state Midwest wellness corridor. I want to talk about that. This idea of intentionally building a strategic roadmap to activate the corridor. So one is to build support for it, one is to activate it. Figuring out how to leverage the resources and the role of those resources in the future wellbeing at a global scale. And then pursuing efforts to globally connect the region's wellbeing ecosystem together, right? So let's walk through each one of these, right? And what I might do is walk through the 4 and then we'll come back to the first one and get comments and input, right? So, but let me go through the 4 first of all, right? So this whole idea of this 5-state wellness corridor. So this is something that, Laurie, you pointed to, that there was some things that sort of came up or developed that were a little bit surprising, right? So one was, it started off as Minnesota leading the way, right? But I think when we look at the scale of the opportunity at a global level is not just Minnesota, it is really the upper Midwest. It is this 5-state kind of conglomeration is where the deepest perspective, I think, of that opportunity resides, and ties to your social connections, right? So you might say, well, why isn't Illinois and Michigan in there? Well, they might be your competitors rather than your collaborators, right? So, we can have that discussion and debate, right? But these 5 states seem to make sense in social ecosystem, social values kind of context and perspective. And the idea was to then start to assign the Global Wellness Connection Steering Group to begin an engagement process to start to draw in those 5 states. So if you look at the kind of larger health ecosystem, you've got some pretty interesting players in that 5-state area, right? So that was the primary initial recommendation. The next one is, okay, I think we've framed an opportunity, I think we've framed this challenge. Now we need to lay out the roadmap, right? So some sort of a thought leader advisory group, and we're going to talk about this sign-up sheet. So we're going to ask people who want to be interested in being part of this to actually do the work to think about a really implementable strategic roadmap that would progress the creation of a Midwest wellness corridor, right? And so that's going to be the group that has to do the thinking about how the hell do we get these players to come together? What is our approach? How do we tackle these big issues? And so on. Third one is leveraging the region's unique natural resources and its role in human well-being. No doubt this set of natural resources, food and water, globally significant. That's not going away. The question is, do we just keep doing what we're doing, which is grow food and send it off, like primary first stage food, or even moved into proteins, or is there a much bigger world of innovation that could be activated? It is interesting that the number of startups that are here that are doing interesting things around food innovation, but could that grow exponentially? Does it become like a leadership component? Does it become like a real go-to for innovation in terms of capitalizing on those resources? Does it, is there a way to build this story much bigger than train loads and boatloads of food that go out? Is it like a whole system? Is it an ability to be able to think about how do we relate to our nutrition and so on in the future? How do we activate that? Is there potential in that? The fourth one here is these efforts to globally connect the region's wellbeing ecosystem, right? Minneapolis St. Paul Airport, number one, right? So you have kind of an obvious kind of logistical connection. But this one here also calls out the potential of the World Expo, right? And Mark, you've talked a lot about the potential of that. Now, the issue with that is it could happen or not, right? I mean, that's a competition, right? A contest, right? But for sure, if this location is successful, that becomes a game-changing event. Right? I mean, that is global attention. That's a once-in-a-lifetime ability. But of course, you've got to be smart and go, well, what's our plan B? If that doesn't happen, it doesn't mean that opportunity or the need has gone away. It just means we have to think about it in a different way or activate it in a different way, right? But anyway, the whole idea is about this showcasing the region's emerging innovation capacity in the realms of human well-being and livability, right? So they were the four kind of high-level sort of recommendations. Jim, I want to hand this to you, right? My final comment on this, right, is that I think, I think the interesting debate around the 5-state, right, is that exciting? Is it attainable? What's the entrance point? Is it like talking about what will gravitate? Do we burn our energy on trying to get the governments together, or do we focus on the sort of ecosystem and the players? I mean, I think they're really good, interesting kind of implementation strategy sort of conversations. I do think if you look at this process from February through to now, though, what it seems to have done, right? And I think we can say this with some confidence because there's no pushback, so straight face test, right? Is that it has articulated an opportunity that seems to resonate with people, that people seem to go, there's clearly something there, right? And I think it has gone through a process of articulating the opportunity and identifying what are the behavioural or the structural things we need to be thinking about. So this notion of collaboration, this notion of finding a way to exert influence at a global kind of perspective, but getting our act together to do that. And then I think there's some really good building blocks here in terms of steps to go down that path. So I don't think, I think it's just like it's really interesting the way that kind of conversation is mapped out, right? The challenge, of course, now is to how do we walk down that path, right? If we go, okay, there is something there, the sense of urgency is fairly grand. We need to kind of figure out new ways to work together, and we need to kind of build our fluency in that. Then how do we do that? And I think they're the next steps. So, Jim, I know you had a couple of comments you want to add, and I'll flip over the slides for you as well. So I think everybody knows Jim Holden. He's been leading the conversation of the Global Wellness Connections. also mayor of Edina forever, just about. And also is involved with the Minnesota Council of Mayors and so on. But somebody who does understand the regional ecosystem very well.
Yeah, well, thank you, David. I think in true Minnesota fashion, what we need to do first of all is express our gratitude to, first of all, Future IQ, David Beurle and Heather Branding. Thank you so much. This was work that was all done on a pro bono basis. Next, we want to thank our hosts, Microsoft, Christian, Doug. Thank you for doing this. Really a wonderful venue, and all these people that think about the future, including our own Green Umbrella folks. We've got people from the chamber here that are involved in the innovation lab, people that are active members and part of the board in the chamber here. Thank you. Our partner, also Greater MSP, and I don't know if anybody here is here from Greater MSP, but I want to thank them as well. So, you know, we talked about, David talked about a couple of times, trajectory, the direction of change, and then velocity, the speed of change. When you're a mayor, anything dealing with change is really a challenge. And so over the years I've been doing this in Edina and in the region, my favorite bumper sticker has been, that I saw one year, was change is good, you go first. And you can kind of pick up the tone of that in this conversation. I mean, people are talking about, well, let's start small and expand from there. Let's get it right on a pilot sort of basis. Let's prove out the concept, which is a great thought. Or let's just go for it, you know. And I can tell you that going for it about a year ago didn't work so well, because I wrote to the mayors and all these towns that show up, and I didn't even get a reply talking about how we could work together on these problems that have such global importance. And with respect to this global wellness connections, you know, you think about the prosperity of the planet and the people that live on it. It all depends on their well-being. And that's the reason a few years ago, right at the beginning of the pandemic, a bunch of us got together that had been down in Memphis on a logistics trip now, looking at how FedEx and Medtronic were working together to accomplish supply chain competency, I'll call it. It led us to this conversation about what we're good at and what we're good at home. And then thinking about it, as we learned more from David about the attributes of the upper Midwest and what's going to be happening in this world that we're living in, this change that's happening, as Michael says, as an exponential basis, and we're going to be facing this scarcity in water, food, and a livable area. What about us? What about us as a region that's no longer a flyover place, but a place that people are going to be moving to? It's a come-to place, not a flyover place. And we can already hear anecdotal stories. We've heard anecdotal stories this morning about people voluntarily moving here, as you call it. And I've heard many of those from some of the realtors up in northern Minnesota, people coming from California, from Texas, coming because they know we're going to have water, that we've got 20% of the world's fresh water. And so as this Global Wellness Connections has been working on a total volunteer basis, and raise your hand if you're involved in Global Wellness Connections, please. It's really a fantastic group that has spent hours and hours and hours. And we've got a structure, thanks to Jay Lindgren and Dorsey. We've got a C6 and a C3 structure. But for those of us that believe in this work and believe in this concept, we need more allies, and we need more assistance. We need financial assistance to keep this going, because it's all been done on a volunteer basis with actual monetary contributions from some of our volunteers. So think about that. In fact, there's a green sheet of paper, I forgot to bring it up with me, that people can hold up, and if you want to get involved with this, you certainly can. Yeah, thanks for holding that up, David. One of the areas that we've been working on is mobility, in addition to the other issues that we've been talking about today, and thinking about how we create this connectivity and the speed of connectivity. In fact, even with the infrastructure bill on a federal level, there's a component of that provides for innovation and transportation, sort of 21st century thinking. And one of those elements is Hyperloop. And I wanted to show you a practical example of something that we're working on at the GWC, and that's a potential connection, or the feasibility of a potential connection between the Twin Cities and Rochester. You think about all the people that make that 90-mile trip every day, that are going for either for work or for health reasons. That hour and a half doesn't really shrink. But with the possibility of something called Hyperloop, and the company that we've been working with called Hyperloop TT, if we can figure out the feasibility of this and get the monies that we need to study the feasibility of it, which isn't really insurmountable, it's $3 to $5 million, we could create a system that would move underground between, let's say, between the Minneapolis airport and the Rochester airport, not in an hour and a half, but in 12 minutes. The speed underground is about 750 miles an hour. Let's run this video.
Imagine a capsule. Imagine a capsule that can carry people. Placed inside a depressurized tube, the air removed to eliminate resistance. Not traveling on rails, but actually levitating above them. Capable of reaching airplane speeds and beyond on the ground. This is a Hyperloop, and it is amazing. Even more amazing, at Hyperloop Transportation Technologies, we haven't been imagining it, we've been building it for the better part of 5 years. And amazing is where we started. We're transforming the passenger experience, putting comfort and safety at the center of everything we're doing. Our reimagined linear electric motor is powered by sustainable solar energy, propelling the capsule on a completely new, incredibly efficient passive levitation system. With these two breakthroughs, our system is capable of giving energy back to the grid. And when something didn't exist, we invented it. Introducing Vibranium, a composite material that monitors speed, capsule integrity, and atmospheric condition in real time, a new benchmark in passenger safety. And we're not done. Our team of over 800 strong, a worldwide intellectual ecosystem of thinkers and problem solvers, tackle each day with the humble goal of changing the world. With its speed and efficiency, the Hyperloop will rewrite the rules of travel and mobility. But that's just one side of the story. There's another side that will have a far greater impact. It's the side that redefines how we connect with one another. Where distant friends become neighbors, countries become neighborhoods. And everybody who inhabits this big, crazy world of ours grows a little closer together. Just imagine that.
Yeah, just imagine that. And think about that in the upper Midwest as well. If we had that line from here to Rochester, on to La Crosse, and then on into Chicago, how we could, especially between the Twin Cities and Rochester, merge those two economies, merge those two labor forces. This technology has such tremendous possibilities that we really do think it's worth trying to find the feasibility money to study it. We have the matching funds that are now available. There's a couple of programs at the federal level we're going to try to get involved in. We've got folks from MnDOT here, and we're going to try to encourage them to think about partnering with us, because we'll need a governmental sponsor to be able to achieve this feasibility study money. But I think it's something worthy of us thinking about on an immediate sort of basis, something that we can all work on together. You know, this notion of the climate changing, us being well positioned in the future for in-migration, it not only creates opportunity, but I think also in Minnesota fashion, we all sense a sense of obligation, or a feeling of obligation, not only to the people that live here, but the people who live in our country, the people who live in the world, because we have all of these things that we can share. We have all of these abilities that don't exist in a lot of parts in the world. And so to the extent that we can increase our agricultural production and more effectively help feed the world and make it a healthier place for all of the medical innovation that we're doing, I think that is not only an opportunity, but it is our obligation. And so I'm really appreciative that all of you that I consider a room full of forward thinkers are here with us today to kind of talk about what the opportunity is, what the obligation is, and so that we can go forward together. So please fill out that sheet. We're so grateful that you were here with us today to help us move to the next step. And I would say again, I can't thank David enough for all the work that he's done to give us the basis to go forward. So thanks everybody for being here today.